Hello and welcome to the College Football Focus. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. Talking about some guys for this weekend, college football in the third week now. And we're talking about the main slates here on Saturday, of course. And you got two different sites, but not every game on every site. So obviously pay attention to which guys are on which sites. And we'll let you know which ones are not. So starting off with Brandon Doughty. It's Doughty, right?
Dowdy, yeah.
Brandon Doughty from Western Kentucky, the Hilltoppers. He's 8,900 on FanDuel, 9,900 on DraftKings, and you mentioned here each week he's one of the highest upside players because this is a high volume offense that scores a lot of points, and he burned some people the first week with a bad performance, although they did still win the game in a tough matchup. So this is a guy that you don't mind paying up for, and he's not one of those big names. He's not from a big conference, but this is a guy that consistently puts up big points, though.
Yeah, that and on FanDuel, I don't see anyone else really in that top tier that is just as good as Dowdy that you feel confident in. And this is one of the higher over/unders of the week against Indiana. Two teams, two very offensive-oriented teams going against each other, 1-point spread. And Indiana has had some trouble against two cupcake opponents, giving up 270 yards average passing. So you have to figure Dowdy's going to have his way with the secondary. Should be a back-and-forth game. So 8,900 on FanDuel. I really like that price point. I think you can pay up for him. 9,900 on DraftKings is a little more of a conversation because there are two other guys that I like for a little bit cheaper, and they are Matt Johnson of Bowling Green. Had a huge week last week. 6 touchdown passes at Maryland. Granted, this is a little more difficult of a matchup against Memphis, but still a pretty solid play. And then the other side of that, you have Paxton Lynch of Memphis. Better matchup because the Bowling Green defense is worse than Memphis. So I think I might like him, put him in that same conversation. And they're both about 1,000, 1,300 cheaper than Dowdy on DraftKings. So that's the way I would be looking there. And I should say that Bowling Green Memphis game is not on FanDuel, so that's why I prefer Dowdy over there.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. So take note of these guys. Next guy's going to be easy to remember. He's the same price on both sites. Thomas Sirk, a guy that was a great value the first week, and he's been a guy that's been a dual threat. And at that price, though, you're not taking on a whole lot of risk and but it's a tough matchup, like you mentioned, facing off against Northwestern, who held Stanford out of the end zone, only scored 6 points in that game. So this is a value play that you're hoping just gives you a nice floor and not a whole lot of upside, but enough that he can pay off his tag.
Yeah, it's just a price-sensitive play just because he's such a good value and he's a dual-threat player, so he can get his fantasy points in multiple ways. So you don't really mind that. He could pick up 60 yards on the ground. Maybe he gets goal line carries too. So you have to like that. If Duke does get in the red zone, he could easily walk in for a score. And 6,600, that's just a really good price tag. I don't see many other players down on that level that have a similar projection as Sirk. So I think he really is a decent recommendation if you need a cheaper guy.
Yeah, and another guy who's the cheaper guy, more so on DraftKings than FanDuel, where you have him mentioned as cash game option on DraftKings and a GPP option on FanDuel with 73 to 53. Big time difference there. Brendan Motley from Virginia Tech. This is a guy that is stepping into the role now with starting quarterback. I can't remember his name. The guy that talked trash, got his collarbone broken. Yeah, Brewer. And got knocked out of the game, but Motley's stepping in, and this is a guy that's a really, really nice value against a Purdue defense that's really nothing special.
Yeah, they're a pretty mediocre defense, and Motley can get it done on the ground as well. He had 53 rushing yards and a touchdown last week, so you like that dual threat capability as a QB2 on DraftKings. So if you're making several tournament lineups, I think he makes for a nice second quarterback consideration there. Just because there's so much to be saved, and you can really go up at your other positions and pay up for some of these studs.
Yeah, absolutely. And then speaking of one of the studs, Leonard Fournette from LSU, one of the better backs in college football now, and $8,400 on FanDuel, $9,500 on DraftKings. Obviously, a better price there on FanDuel. And you mentioned here he might be in the midst of a Heisman campaign, and he's the guy that gets a ton of volume work in that backfield.
Yeah, I'm expecting another 25 or so carries, 150 plus yards, maybe 2 touchdowns even. On the surface, this looks like a tough matchup against Auburn, that SEC defense. But if you remember 2 weeks ago, Auburn gave up 238 yards to Louisville. 3 rushing touchdowns, and 5 yards per carry. So you figure a better offensive line there at LSU, a better running back in Fournette, and he should be able to do his thing this week. So 8,400 on FanDuel, I like that price. 9,500 on DraftKings, a little more difficult to work in, but still worth considering.
Yeah, and Auburn didn't exactly shut down Jacksonville State last week either, so
yeah,
that got outgained in that game too. Next up, Jihad Thomas from Temple, $7,700 on FanDuel. Nice and pricey on DraftKings at $9,500. But you mentioned here that $9,500 seems more indicative of what you actually expect out of him because this guy has some big-time upside.
Yeah, and the fact that he's playing UMass is just a great matchup. UMass has been one of the worst rushing defenses over the past few seasons, and he basically tore up Penn State and Cincinnati, so Penn State especially a respectable, solid defense there. So you have to figure just by, using that logic that he should have a pretty decent game here against UMass, and Temple checks in as 10-point favorites. So, they're going to be kind of milking the clock in the second half. So I think Thomas, he should get a lot of possessions, a lot of carries, and 7,700 on FanDuel is, it's more than you're used to seeing him. A guy like this that's, a relative unknown. It's more than some people might be willing to pay, but I still think that's a relative value.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And then on the Cincinnati side, Tion Green, $6,900. Obviously, just a FanDuel play because he's not listed on DraftKings in the Cincinnati-Miami game. And he's been the number one running back. And you mentioned here, this Miami-Ohio defense that, I'm not sure that it's ever been particularly good, but especially bad this season.
Yeah, and it's just one of those typical MAC defenses that is not very good at all. More built for speed than, power, than shutting down power teams, as we saw last week with Wisconsin. So I think Cincinnati, they're going to have plenty of rushing attempts in a bounce-back week after a bad loss to Temple. They're probably just going to pound the ball down Miami's throat. And Tion Green, as the number one running back, could have a big day because of that. It's a 35-point spread, so you're kind of concerned he might get pulled in the second half. But if they get out by that much, I'm willing to bet that Tion Green will have something to do with it. So I don't think he's a bad value play over there on FanDuel.
Makes sense. And speaking of great value plays, a guy that the price is just baffling on, one of the better receivers in all of college football, Kevin Lucas from Tulsa, $6,800 on FanDuel, $6,400 on DraftKings, and that's the exact wording that you used there. You said it baffles you, and this is a guy that's going to have incredibly high ownership this weekend due to that really cheap price tag.
Yeah, and I should note, there was a miscue there on the DraftKings price. It should be $7,600. I might have forgotten to change that from last week, but still, that's cheaper than you'd expect, and especially a lot cheaper on FanDuel than you expect. I think week one he was $8,600 or something like that, in that range. So he's $2,000 less, and he's been putting up great numbers over the past 2 weeks. It really doesn't make any sense. Granted, this is a little tougher matchup against Oklahoma. They have some capable corners, capable pass rushers to kind of, stifle the Tulsa passing game. But then again, Kevin Lucas, they like to get the ball in his hands, like to hit him with some quick routes and just, give him space to make plays. So he will rack up his receptions, especially with Tulsa playing from behind. And the cheaper than usual price point really kind of mitigates that risk. If he was $8,800 or so, where he should be over there on FanDuel, I would say, yeah, it's probably more of a tournament play, but he just fits so easily into a cash game lineup that I think you can have a lot of confidence in him this week.
Yeah, that's a good call there. And Tajaye Sharp from UMass, $6,900 on FanDuel, not listed on DraftKings because
he actually. I forgot to. I need to change that as well. He is listed on DraftKings, $6,600, so even better price over there. Yeah, I'm gonna have to make some edits to that article. I don't know what I was doing.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Even better that he's available on DraftKings there as well at that cheap price tag. So why don't you let me know why you're on this guy?
Yeah, well, if you remember last week, he was one of our top picks, and he came through 11 catches, 138 yards against Colorado, and almost made it into the end zone a couple times, but didn't get the score. So you have to really like his prospects this week. By the way, I was actually watching that UMass-Colorado game, and it just kind of makes you wonder how good daily fantasy sports really is, because why else would anyone not involved with UMass or Colorado be watching that game?
Ever.
If it weren't for betting or daily fantasy sports. So, yeah, there's your public service announcement that it really does help the industry, sports in general. But yeah, Sharp, definitely a top receiver. UMass should be playing from behind this week. They're 10-point underdogs at home versus Temple, so you have to like that they're playing at home too. That's a nice little bonus. And yeah, those 11 catches, 138 yards. That's not a fluke. He could really repeat that performance and actually get into the end zone this time. So I think that's an easy play for his price point.
Absolutely. And then next one was the guy that was a disappointment last week, but it was a blowout. John L. Barnes from Duke, $5,000 on FanDuel, $4,700 on DraftKings. And you're expecting him to fill the role of a recently departed guy. So who are you looking at there?
Yeah, he was. If you remember, Crowder last season was the do-it-all wide receiver for Duke, and they just had him on sweeps sometimes, had him lined up in the backfield, give him some draw plays, threw him a lot of screen, short passes, drag routes. And that week 1 game against Tulane, I think it was, yeah, they had John L. Barnes fit into that role. He had 10 receptions, over 100 yards, and a touchdown. So I'm thinking that Duke will need to pass it a little more than against Northwestern this week in order to move the ball, so that, kind of sets up well for Barnes, catching those short passes, racking up receptions, and, maybe breaking one some yards after the catch. So he's a cheap play that I really like. He's cheap on both sites. Even though it was a little bit difficult, there's a lot of good wide receivers that are cheap. Boyd of UNLV is one of them. I really like him, except his quarterback, Blake Decker, is questionable. So if he were out, that might taper his expectations a little bit, because I don't know how confident I feel in UNLV's backup quarterback.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then moving over here to tight end, where obviously these are FanDuel only recommendations. Every once in a while you get one of these guys that's listed as a wide receiver that's available on DraftKings, but you're not going to put a tight end in your flex spot on DraftKings, or at least you shouldn't be. And
maybe this one guy we're going to mention.
Yeah, this one guy
depending
here.
on price.
Yeah, he's definitely got some upside, and he's been a great play on FanDuel the first couple weeks. Tyler Higbee, $3,700. We even saw last week, caught a pass, down, fumbled at the 1-yard line. You and I were lamenting that a little bit, having had both those guys in some lineups. But, I mean, he's been a guy who's been very productive. And at $3,700, you mentioned similar production, you think, to a wide receiver too, which at $3,700, I mean, that's below the actual minimum salary for the wide receivers on FanDuel.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's one way I like to look at it, is that, he is the most expensive tight end. But then again, I look at him as just a pass catcher alone, and he could easily put up that production as your second wide receiver, maybe top-tier wide receiver. So he's $4,900 on DraftKings also. I just looked that up. I don't really hate that price if it works, and it's your last wide receiver to click in there, because he will get the volume in this game. Western Kentucky is probably just going to throw the entire game against Indiana. And Indiana, as we said before, pretty bad secondary. They struggled against some bad teams through the air. So I think Higbee, he has emerged kind of as one of the top targets in this Western Kentucky offense, because Dangerfield, their wide receiver, their number 1 wide receiver from a year ago, is a little bit dinged up, still dealing with a hamstring injury that he's playing through, obviously less effective. So Higbee has been a beneficiary of that, and I think it'll definitely continue in this high-scoring game.
Yeah, that's a great call there. And then last up, you mentioned here, if you're not paying for Higbee, you're going to want to be saving some money so you can fit one extra stud somewhere and elsewhere in your lineup. Maybe move one of your value plays up to a mid-range type. Desroy Maxwell for NIU. Huskies taking on Ohio State. Got to imagine that this is going to be a team that's going to be behind nearly the entire game. And 4 for 43 and a touchdown last week is not too bad. So for minimum salary, I think you're looking at him for some potential value there.
Yeah, and this pretty much just comes down to matchup, because Ohio State, as we know, one of the worst defenses in the country, and they have been for a very long time over the past 2 decades. But really, it's just you're hoping to get something from Maxwell here. He did catch that touchdown last week. They send him on the streak down the middle, off play action. Not sure how effective he'll be, but as you said, Northern Illinois is going to be throwing more than normal in this game, so you're just hoping Maxwell will be on the other end of some of those receptions. And for minimum salary, he's the only one I really see down there who maybe warrants your attention. Obviously, the key here is to love everything else on your lineup and just have a filler down there and hope he does something. So, I mean, that's the only reason you're going to pay down at the tight end position. Otherwise, it's going to be Higbee.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense there. So thanks for hanging out with us here. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out the rest of our great content for this weekend at dailyfantasycafe.com.